Nobody in that polished glass boardroom noticed him. He was just the janitor after all, mopping floors at 5 a.m., emptying trash bins, wiping down fingerprints from the thick glass doors that separated the powerful from the invisible. But that morning, as sunlight scraped across the Manhattan skyline and bled into the top-floor conference room, 27-year-old Luis Rivera was there, mop in hand. Just as the Billionaire CEO Stephen Grayson stormed in, flanked by lawyers and executives, in suits worth more than Luis's entire year of rent. Grayson's empire was built on steel and ruthlessness. He was the kind of man who believed money solved everything. That power was the right to silence those who could not keep up. He came to that meeting to close a deal worth $400 million with a delegation from a small but rapidly growing East African nation. It was the deal that would secure Grayson's expansion across another continent, making his name echo further than it already did. But there was a problem. The translator Grayson had arranged was stuck in customs at JFK, and the delegation had just arrived, waiting patiently, speaking Swahili, their eyes quietly observing the nervous American executives, fumbling on their phones for a solution. Grayson tried to keep his composure. But the vein on his forehead told another story as he hissed, "Get me someone, anyone, who can translate now." Luis paused with the mop, watching the scene unfold, heart pounding. For a moment, the whispers of his mother's voice came back to him, "Lucito, nunca olvides de donde vienes." Never forget where you came from. She had taught him Swahili when he was just 5, while they lived in a Nairobi apartment before moving to the Bronx. His mother had been a translator for NGOs, teaching Luis every phrase, every inflection, telling him that language was power. A bridge that could save lives or break them. Luis's hands shook slightly as he tightened his grip on the mop handle. He could walk away, keep cleaning, stay invisible, as always. But something in him, maybe the memory of his mother fighting cancer, working 2 jobs while volunteering to translate for refugees who had nothing, told him that silence was no longer an option. The room was spiraling into chaos now, Grayson's lawyers arguing, the East African delegation checking their watches, about to leave. The deal, the power, the headlines about to slip through Grayson's hands. And then, quietly, Luis stepped forward, setting the mop against the wall. His heart thundered, but his voice was calm as he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Grayson, I can help." Every head turned. The room froze. Grayson's icy blue eyes snapped to Luis with disbelief. "What did you just say?" Luis swallowed, holding his ground. "I can translate. I speak Swahili." There was a beat of stunned silence before the laughter started. A sharp, uncomfortable sound from one of the junior executives trying to ease the tension. But the delegation's leader, Minister Barraza, turned toward Luis with genuine curiosity in his eyes. He said something in Swahili, clear and measured. Luis inhaled, his mother's lessons ringing in his ears. He replied fluently, respectfully, explaining that he worked here as janitorial staff but was honored to assist if they wished. Minister Barraza's eyes lit up with surprise and warmth, and he responded in Swahili. "Then, let's begin." Grayson's jaw tightened. His empire, his power, now depended on a janitor he had never even noticed before. But he had no choice. "Fine," Grayson snapped, waving Luis forward. "You stand here and translate everything." Luis nodded, stepping into the sunlight that poured across the glass table, feeling the weight of every eye in the room on him. His heart was pounding so loudly it was almost deafening, but he stood tall. This was for his mother. This was for every invisible worker who had dreams bigger than their uniforms allowed. And as the meeting began, Luis translated seamlessly. Every phrase, every nuance, every subtle smile, and carefully chosen word that the delegation offered. With each sentence, he saw Grayson's arrogance begin to crack, replaced by a thin layer of dependence and a flicker of fear, because in that moment, it was Luis who held the power, and he wasn't going to waste it. Luis stood beside the conference table, shoulders squared, translating with the precision of someone who understood that words were more than just sounds, they were weapons, shields, lifelines. Each phrase from Minister Barraza's delegation flowed through Luis like a current, steady and calm. As he bridged the worlds of polished Manhattan skyscrapers and the red-dusted roads of Nairobi from his memory. At first, Stephen Grayson barely looked at him, eyes darting between the delegation and his restless lawyers. Tapping pens, checking watches, whispering about stock prices and PR disasters if the deal fell apart. But as Luis continued, his voice unwavering, each translation flawless. Even Grayson's cold blue eyes began to linger on him longer. Trying to decipher how a janitor could command a room without raising his voice, Minister Barraza smiled as he spoke, expressing appreciation for the respectful young man who understood the language of his mother. Luis translated it word for word, but inside, something shifted. Respect, a word Luis rarely heard in his direction, much less in a room where millionaires and billionaires decided the fate of nations with the flick of a pen. Grayson's fingers drummed on the table, impatience bubbling beneath the surface. He had intended to bully this delegation into a deal favorable only to him, using language barriers as leverage. Confident they would agree to avoid the frustration of miscommunication. But Luis was undoing that plan with each sentence. Guys, Luis did not skip the parts that mattered. He did not soften the delegation's concerns about environmental damage or the exploitation of local workers that Grayson's plans would cause. He translated their truths as they were unfiltered, unapologetic, and for the first time, Grayson looked vulnerable. The junior executives watched Luis with a mix of confusion and suspicion. Eyes narrowing when Luis's translations made the delegation's conditions clearer. One of them, a man named Connor, leaned toward Grayson, whispering, "We can't let him keep controlling the flow like this. We're losing ground." Grayson shot him a glare but said nothing, because deep down he knew Luis was the only bridge keeping the deal alive. As the hours ticked by, Luis noticed the small things others would have missed. The way Grayson's lawyer flinched when Barraza mentioned community benefit agreements. The quick exchange of glances between Grayson and Connor when the delegation insisted on labor rights protections. The way Grayson's voice turned softer when he realized he could not hide behind half-dashed truths. It was during a short coffee break that Minister Barraza approached Luis, offering him a small, respectful nod. "Your mother would be proud," he said in Swahili, placing a warm hand on Luis's shoulder. Luis's breath caught, emotions rising in his chest like a tide he could barely control. "I hope so, sir," he replied quietly. "Keep telling the truth," Barraza said. "Even when they fear it." The delegation returned to their seats, ready to finalize terms that would protect their people and land. Luis knew Grayson would not like these terms, but it was not his job to make Grayson comfortable. It was his job to translate the truth. But Luis also began to see that this was bigger than a contract. The delegation shared documents laying out proof that Grayson's subsidiary had quietly acquired land under false pretenses in 2 provinces, pushing families from their homes with broken promises. Grayson's confident smirk began to slip, replaced by a pale, tight-lipped tension. "Translate," Grayson ordered, his voice low. Luis did. Word for word. Because for the first time in his life, Luis realized he was no longer a janitor in this room. He was the voice, and power was shifting. Whether Stephen Grayson liked it or not, Luis felt the weight of every breath in that boardroom as he translated Minister Barraza's words about displaced families, stolen lands, and the unkept promises made by Grayson's subsidiaries. Each word Luis spoke was a blade slicing through the false calm Grayson had tried to maintain. And for the first time, Luis saw fear in the billionaire's eyes. Grayson shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping nervously against the polished oak table. Behind him, Connor and the lawyers exchanged hushed, frantic whispers, scrolling through tablets, trying to find counter-arguments, excuses, anything that would keep the walls from closing in. Minister Barraza leaned forward, placing a thin stack of documents on the table with quiet finality. The papers looked ordinary, but Luis knew, as he translated Barrasa's steady words, that these pages held the power to destroy empires. "These are testimonies from families your company forced off their land," Barrasa said, his voice calm. "Photos of bulldozers clearing ancestral homes. Receipts from bribes your men paid to local officials." Luis's hands trembled as he turned each document toward Grayson, translating the words without hesitation. For years, Luis had felt invisible, a ghost in the hallways of the wealthy, cleaning up their messes while they laughed about profits. But now Luis's voice was not only being heard, it was necessary. Grayson slammed his palm on the table, his mask of control cracking. "It's his blackmail," he spat, his voice hoarse. Luis looked at him, eyes steady. "He says it's the truth?" For a moment, everything went silent. Even the hum of the city below seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of Luis's heartbeat pounding in his ears. He remembered his mother's soft voice telling him stories of courage as she folded laundry. Late into the night, Lucido, the truth always finds a way. Even if it takes time. But something else came back to him, a memory he had long buried. Luis's mother had once worked for Grayson's company, back when she was new to America. Believing she had found an opportunity to build a future for them, she had come home one night, her eyes red. Clutching documents she said would help the families Grayson's projects were harming. Documents she was too afraid to turn in. Luis swallowed, the realization hitting him with the weight of years. Documents. Could they be the same? The delegation began speaking again, and Luis translated with perfect composure even as his mind raced. Barrasa was offering Grayson a choice: sign a deal that included reparations for the displaced families and strict environmental protections, or watch the documents go public, unraveling Grayson's empire. Luis translated the conditions clearly, his voice unwavering while Grayson's breathing grew ragged. His empire teetering on the edge of collapse in front of the janitor he had never noticed. Then, as the conversation paused, Barrasa turned to Luis, his gaze sharp yet kind. "Your mother, Maria Rivera," he said softly in Swahili. "She helped gather these documents. She risked everything for the truth." Luis froze. His mother's name spoken aloud in this room hit him like a wave, the pain of her quiet suffering crashing into him. She had died believing she had failed to make a difference, hiding documents in a box under her bed, telling Luis only that someday the right person will need them. Luis' throat tightened, tears stinging his eyes as he struggled to maintain his composure. She did," he whispered. Barrasa nodded. "Her work helped us find the truth. Now it's your turn to help us bring it into the light." Grayson's face twisted, confusion giving way to rage. "What is he saying? What is he saying?" Luis looked up, standing straighter than he ever had in his life, the weight of his mother's legacy on his shoulders, and said calmly, "He says it's time for you to choose the truth or your downfall." The room felt smaller, the tension crackling in the air like static before a storm. Luis realized he was no longer just translating for a delegation. He was standing in the place his mother once dreamed of, speaking the truths she had carried, alone, turning her quiet pain into a weapon against the man who had built an empire on silence. Grayson opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat, his eyes flickering with a fear he could no longer disguise. Because for the first time in decades, the billionaire CEO who thought power meant buying silence realized he had no control over the one thing he feared most: the truth. The night after the meeting, Luis sat on the edge of his narrow bed, the documents spread across the thin blanket, their edges curling from age and the weight of secrets. His mother's handwriting was on some pages, small, careful notes in the margins, dates, names, amounts. She had risked everything to gather this evidence, and for years, Luis had tucked it away in a shoebox under layers of clothes, too afraid to understand what they meant, too busy surviving to believe he could do anything with them now. The papers felt like a living flame in his hands. He heard her voice in the back of his mind. the lullabies in Spanish that once soothed him when fear pressed against the walls of their tiny apartment. Ala volar. Nois, la ausencia de miedo, lucito, sino. Seguir adelante, a pesar del delane. Courage is not the absence of fear, but moving forward despite it at dawn. Luis stood in front of the mirror in his janitor's uniform, pressing his hand against the cold glass. In that reflection, he did not see a cleaner anymore. He saw a man, holding the power of truth, a son ready to honor the promise hidden in every tired breath his mother took when she said, "Someday, someone will need these." The next day, Luis returned to the boardroom with the delegation, holding a simple manila folder. Grayson's eyes narrowed when he saw it, and for the first time, the billionaire did not look through Luis. He looked at him, truly seeing the threat he represented. "Is that another trick?" Grayson sneered, trying to keep his composure. As cameras from the press circled outside for a scheduled photo opportunity with the delegation, Luis placed the folder on the table, sliding it forward without a word. His hands did not shake this time. Barraza nodded at him, a silent gesture of trust. Grayson flipped open the folder, his face paling with every line he read. There were bank records tracing illegal payments, emails showing collusion with corrupt officials, internal memos referencing intimidation tactics against local leaders. And the handwriting in the margins. Luce's mother's notes named the people Grayson had silenced, the families he had displaced, the threats that had ensured their silence. The room was silent except for the soft shuffle of papers as Grayson turned page after page, the life draining from his face. "What is this?" Grayson whispered, his arrogance cracking, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple. "Where did you get this?" Luce's voice was calm, steady. "My mother gathered these before she died. She wanted to protect the families you hurt. She wanted someone to tell the truth." Grayson's eyes flickered, rage mixing with fear. "You think you can destroy me with this? Do you know who I am?" Luis leaned forward, his eyes unblinking. "Yes, and I know who she was. Maria Rivera. You might have forgotten her, but you will never forget what she left behind." A tremor ran through Grayson's hands as he set the documents down, trying to compose himself. He glanced at his lawyers, who were already scrolling through their phones, their faces pale as they realized the potential fallout. The delegation sat quietly, waiting, their faith in Luis evident in the way they watched him, not Grayson. Luis continued to translate the conversation as the delegation laid out new terms: reparations, environmental commitments, and an independent investigation to oversee the rebuilding of the displaced communities. Each term was a blow to Grayson's empire, but Luis did not soften the words. He spoke them exactly as they were meant to be heard. That at one point, Grayson's lawyer leaned in, whispering something frantically, but Grayson waved him off. His gaze was locked on Luis, as if trying to understand how a janitor, someone he deemed insignificant, could corner him so completely. "You think this will end me?" Grayson said, his voice strained, desperation leaking through. "I have friends, connections, power." Luce's eyes did not waver. "Power is nothing if it stands on lies." Outside, the press was waiting, and Luis knew this was the moment. He had spent nights practicing what he would say, but when he opened his mouth, he spoke from the place in his heart where his mother's memory lived. "Do you want to know why I'm here today, Mr. Grayson?" Luis asked, his voice clear. "Because you built your wealth on the suffering of people like my mother. You silenced voices with fear, but you forgot that fear can turn into courage when the truth is all you have left." Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but the delegation stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Barraza looked at Luis, smiling softly. "Thank you," he said, in English this time so Grayson would hear it too. Luis nodded, gathering the documents, feeling the weight of his mother's legacy turning into something larger. Promise fulfilled. A seed of change planted in the heart of power as he walked out of the boardroom. The reporters outside turned, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. For a moment, Luis hesitated, the fear of a lifetime tightening in his chest. But then he saw a reflection of himself in the glass doors. Standing tall, the folder in his hand, his mother's spirit beside him. Luis stepped forward, ready to speak. Because for the first time, the janitor was not cleaning up after the powerful. He was cleaning up the lies they had left behind. The glass doors slid open, and Luis stepped into a wall of flashing cameras, microphones jostling for position, reporters shouting questions in a dozen languages. For a split second, fear clawed at him, the memory of nights spent scrubbing floors in silence, while swallowing his voice to keep his job of a life defined by invisibility. Then he felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, though. She had been gone for years. Her soft voice, tired but unbroken, whispering, "Habla, Lucido." Speak. Luis adjusted his posture, lifted his chin, and took a deep breath. The microphones quivered closer. "My name is Luis Rivera," he began, his voice carrying over the noise, clear and resonant, steady with a quiet force that made even the clicking cameras pause. "I am the janitor you ignored. The cleaner you pretended didn't exist. But today, I stand here not just for myself, but for every family you hurt." Inside, Grayson was yelling into his phone, demanding his PR team control the situation, ordering security to clear the reporters, but it was too late. Luis was live on social media feeds, streaming to millions, and people were listening. Luis held up the manila folder, the symbol of everything Grayson had tried to hide. Inside these pages is proof of corruption, of land stolen, of voices silenced by threats and money. Proof that Maria Rivera, my mother, spent her life collecting because she believed that someday someone would need to speak for those who couldn't. A reporter asked, "Why now, Luis? Why today?" Luis's eyes glistened as he looked into the cameras. "'Cause I realized silence is not survival, it is surrender. My mother died believing the truth would die with her, but I refused to let that happen." The crowd outside the headquarters grew, workers from the buildings stepping outside, curious passersby stopping, holding up their phones, some whispering prayers, others watching with tears. Seeing a reflection of their own struggles in Luis's trembling but unbreakable voice. "I have spent years cleaning these floors." Luis continued, his voice thick but strong. "And in that time I saw the waste, the excess, the hypocrisy of people who preach about social responsibility while destroying lives in the shadows. Today, we pull those shadows into the light." Inside, Grayson's team was in chaos, scrambling to find statements, calling their allies, trying to flood social media with distractions. But the truth had its own power. Screens across the country showed Luis standing firm, the folder in his hand, the resolve in his eyes. A reporter leaned forward. "Are you afraid of what might happen to you, Luis?" He paused, thinking of the nights he walked home watching for cars that slowed near him. The threatening phone calls, the quiet dismissals when he tried to share his mother's story in the past. He remembered his mother's soft weeping in the dark, praying for a world that would protect her son. Luis met the reporter's eyes, and a single tear slipped down his cheek, but he did not look away. "Yes, I am afraid. But I am more afraid of a world where men like Grayson believe they can destroy lives without consequence. Where children grow up believing that silence is their only protection." The crowd around him fell silent. The cities hum momentarily, pausing as the weight of his words sank in. At that moment, the young girl in the front, holding her mother's hand, called out softly, "Gracias, Señor Luis." Her mother wiped her eyes, nodding, whispering, "Thank you." Luis's heart tightened, but he smiled. He looked into the camera and spoke directly to those watching. To every mother who worked until her hands bled. To every father who lost his job for telling the truth. To every child who saw their parents crushed under the weight of injustice, you are not alone anymore. We see you. We will not be silent. Reporters pressed forward. "What happens next, Luis?" Luis lifted the folder, his mother's handwriting visible in the margin, a signature of defiance from beyond the grave. "Next, We let justice do its work. We give these documents to those who will not be bought. And if they try to silence us again, we will speak louder." Inside, Grayson was cornered. Watching Luce's speech stream live on the giant monitors he once used to display stock prices and quarterly profits. His face was pale, sweat pooling at the base of his neck, his hands shaking as he realized the janitor he dismissed was dismantling his empire with words more powerful than any weapon. As Luis walked down the steps, the crowd parted, people reaching out to touch his hand, thanking him, calling him hero, calling him Hijo de la Verdad. The phrase echoed in the air, son of truth. Luis felt something shift inside him, the burden of silence lifting, replaced by the heavy but righteous weight of purpose. He did not walk away in fear. He walked into the crowd, each step a promise. To his mother that her voice was not lost, that her legacy was alive, roaring in the hearts of people who had been afraid to speak. Because in that moment, the janitor who had once swept away dust was sweeping away the darkness that Grayson had left behind. And for the first time, Luis truly felt seen. In the days that followed, Luce's face was everywhere. News anchors called him the janitor who shook a billionaire. Influencers reposted his speech with tears in their eyes. And workers in factories and offices whispered his name, as if it were a promise of hope. But with the light came the shadows. The first threat arrived as an unmarked envelope slipped under his apartment door late at night. Inside was a single photograph of Luis walking home, circled in red marker with the words, "Stay silent." For a moment, old fear returned, wrapping around his chest like cold iron. Making it hard to breathe, Luis sat in the darkness, clutching the photograph, remembering his mother's trembling hands as she tried to hide her fear. How she whispered, "Don't ever let them see you break, mijo." He didn't sleep that night, but as dawn broke, he burned the photo over the kitchen sink, the ashes rising like tiny gray birds. He would not run. Not this time. Across the city, Grayson was losing control of the empire he had built on intimidation and corruption. Investors were pulling out, stocks tumbling, board members resigning, afraid to be tied to the scandal. Whistleblowers, inspired by Luce's courage, came forward one by one. Accountants who had been forced to forge numbers, engineers pressured to overlook safety codes, secretaries who had seen cash-filled envelopes passed under tables. Each testimony was a hammer blow against the walls Grayson had built around himself. Luis was invited to speak at a union hall, a cramped room filled with workers whose faces told stories of exhaustion and quiet dignity. He stood before them, clutching the microphone, heart pounding. He told them about Maria Rivera, the woman who cleaned floors so her son could have shoes for school, who died believing her truth would die with her. "I'm not a hero," Luis told them, voice shaking. "I'm just tired of being afraid." Older man in the back stood, tears in his eyes, and said, "You're not alone, son." Applause erupted, not the polite clapping of an audience, but the thunderous, desperate clapping of people who had been waiting their whole lives to see someone stand up and live to tell about it. Luis walked home that night under the glow of streetlights, every step heavy, with the knowledge that his life would never be the same. Yet, for the first time, he felt the fear shift into something else, purpose. Meanwhile, in his glass tower, Grayson was cornered. His PR team quit, leaving him alone with screens full of collapsing numbers and videos of Luce's speech flooding every platform. The calls from his powerful friends went unanswered, their silence louder than any words. He sat at his desk sweating, the silence of the office pressing down on him. The only sound, the echo of Luce's words playing on a loop in his mind. "We will not be silent." In a final attempt to regain control, Grayson called Luis. Luis was in the foundation office, helping sort donations for workers facing eviction due to corrupt landlord schemes tied to Grayson's network. His phone buzzed, and when he saw the number, he paused, the room falling silent as he answered. "Luis Rivera," he said, steady. "You think you're a hero, boy?" Grayson's voice was low, poisonous. You're a janitor who doesn't understand how the world works. You're putting yourself and everyone you care about in danger." Luis closed his eyes, breathing through the fear that clawed at him. "You're wrong," he replied softly. "I understand exactly how the world works. It's people like you who have made it cruel, okay? And people like my mother who made it worth fighting for." Grayson's voice cracked. "You don't know what you've started." Luis opened his eyes, looking around the small office where volunteers were working late, laughter and purpose in their tired smiles. "Yes, I do," he replied. "I've started a world where my mother's story isn't forgotten. Like you learn that power isn't a shield against accountability." There was silence on the other end before Grayson whispered, "You will regret this." Luis hung up, his hands shaking, but when he looked around, he saw nods of support, quiet smiles, and a sense that something larger than fear was holding them all together. The next morning, El Foundation's door was smashed in, files scattered. Across the floor, the office ransacked. Luis stood in the wreckage, breathing heavily, the smell of dust and fear sharp in the air. But then he noticed something. They had only destroyed the physical space. The real fight, the documents, the testimonies, the recordings, they were safe. Copied, backed up, shared with reporters, lawyers, and community leaders. Luis turned to his volunteers and said, "They think this will stop us. They don't understand. This is when we fight harder." And they did. Within hours, local news stations were broadcasting images of the destroyed office. The public outrage turning into waves of donations and support. Lawyers offered their services pro bono. Workers volunteered to guard the foundation. At night, neighbors brought food and blankets. Grayson had tried to silence Luis with fear, but instead, he had created a movement. On social media, hashtags trended. Hashtag Justice for Maria, hashtag Luis Rivera. Truth cannot be silenced. Each message, each retweet. Each post was a reminder that Luis was not alone. That Maria Rivera was not alone. That no one who fought for justice would ever be truly alone again as the sun set. Luis stood on the steps of the repaired office, looking out at the small crowd that had gathered, candles in their hands. Their faces illuminated by soft, determined light. "Let them try to scare us," Luis said, his voice carrying across the street. "We have each other. We have the truth. And we are not going anywhere." In that moment, Luis realized that the fight was no longer just his dot. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced. Everyone who had ever been afraid. Everyone who had ever dared to believe that the world could be better. And as the candles flickered, Luis felt his mother's presence in the breeze, in the warmth of the people standing with him, in the quiet certainty that justice, once awakened, would not be put back to sleep. The morning of the trial felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Luis woke up before dawn, sitting quietly in the dark, the city still asleep around him. On the nightstand sat his mother's photo, her soft eyes looking at him, a quiet promise of courage in the lines of her tired smile. He whispered, "Today, Mama, we speak." The courthouse was a fortress of marble and cold glass, the steps crowded with journalists, activists, and workers holding handmade signs that read, "Justice for Maria. Truth cannot be silenced. We are all Luis." Inside, Grayson sat at the defense table, his expensive suit unable to hide the sweat at his temples, his hands gripping the edge of the table, knuckles white. His lawyers whispered, flipping through folders, but their confidence was cracked. The fortress of money and fear that had protected Grayson for decades now crumbling under the weight of truth. Luis walked in, wearing a simple white shirt and black pants. No tie, no pretense. Just a man carrying the memory of a mother who had scrubbed floors so he could live. As he passed Grayson, their eyes met. There was no fear in Luis's gaze, only a quiet fire that made Grayson look away first. Reporters scribbled furiously as the judge entered, the room rising, the air electric with anticipation. This was not just a trial, it was a reckoning. The prosecution began with facts, Fraudulent deals, forged documents, millions stolen from workers' pensions. Threats against whistleblowers, including the evidence Luis had risked everything to bring forward. Each piece of evidence was a chisel strike against the myth of Grayson's untouchable power. Then it was Luis's turn. He took the stand, the microphone picking up the slight tremble in his breath. Before he began, he looked at the crowd journalists, workers, people live streaming on their phones, and then at the judge. "My name is Luis Rivera." He began, voice steady, and my mother's name was Maria Rivera. He told them everything, how she worked double shifts, cleaning the offices of men like Grayson, how she died quietly, her truth buried under the weight of fear, how he discovered her notes hidden in an old shoebox, how he took a janitor's job to get close enough to speak the truth in a room that would listen. His voice broke once, when he described her last words to him. "Nunca te dejes romper, mijo. Don't let them break you, my son." Tears slipped down the cheeks of strangers in the courtroom, reporters pausing to wipe their eyes, workers in the back clutching each other's hands. Heads bowed. Luis lifted his chin, voice rising. "You see, Mr. Grayson thought that people like me, like my mother, don't matter, that we're invisible. But today, I need you all to see us." His words echoed in the courtroom, a truth too loud to ignore. When the defense tried to discredit him, throwing questions meant to rattle him, Luis stood firm. When they tried to call him a thief for recording conversations, he replied calmly, "I did what I had to do so that you could hear what people like Grayson say when they think no one is listening." Outside the courthouse, people gathered, holding candles, watching the proceedings live on screens set up by advocacy groups. Hashtags trended again. Hashtag Luis Rivera, hashtag Justice for Maria, hashtag The Reckoning. Then it was Grayson's turn to testify. His lawyer advised against it, but Grayson, desperate to control the narrative, insisted. He walked to the stand, trying to summon the arrogance that had served him all his life. But the questions were sharp, the evidence undeniable. Each denial only made him look smaller, each lie exposed in real time by recordings Luis had provided, by documents Theodore Grayson's own son had leaked, by testimonies of workers no longer afraid. The moment that broke him came when the prosecutor played the clip of Luis saying, "You forgot to ask what the price of justice is," while Grayson's voice replied, "You will regret this." Silence filled the courtroom as Grayson's threats, once so powerful, now sounded pathetic, hollow. When the verdict was read guilty on all counts, the room erupted. Luis closed his eyes, tears streaming down his face. A release of years of tears, of grief and fear and quiet determination. As Grayson was led away in handcuffs, he looked back at Luis. His eyes no longer filled with rage or arrogance, but with the empty realization that he had lost everything to a janitor who refused to be invisible. Outside, as the crowd cheered, Luis stepped down the courthouse steps, lifting his mother's photo to the sky. "This is for you, Mama." News outlets broadcast images of Grayson being driven away in a police van. The symbol of a world where money could buy silence shattered in a single day. The next week, Luis stood at the opening of the Maria Rivera Foundation, created using funds recovered from Grayson's seized assets. The foundation would provide legal aid, housing, and education to workers silenced by fear and poverty. Turning Maria's story into a light for others, he looked around the community center, seeing former janitors, waitresses, drivers, and undocumented workers, all holding candles in a circle, all whispering Maria's name. Luis spoke softly, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "My mother cleaned their floors, but her spirit was never beneath them. Today, we build something that will outlive their greed." The room echoed with applause, and Luis felt her presence in that moment, the scent of lavender from her aprons, the warmth of her calloused hands, the soft hum of her lullabies on sleepless nights. As the candles flickered, Luis knew the fight would continue, that there would always be another Grayson, another family in fear, another truth trying to find its way to the light. But he also knew that the silence had been broken, that people who once believed they had no voice would stand, speak, and fight, and that the legacy of a janitor named Maria Rivera and a son who refused to let her story die would live on in every act of courage, in every whisper of hope, in every person who decided that silence would no longer define them. And somewhere in a quiet place beyond pain and fear, Maria Rivera smiled.